My name is Sobel, and I'm on the Board of Directors of Ncjw LA and co-chair of our Advocacy Committee. Inspired by Jewish values, Ncjw strives for social justice by improving the quality of life for women, children, and families, and by safeguarding individual rights and freedoms. Ncjw LA serves more than 12,000 individuals through our many programs. These include community, mental health, and supportive services, youth educational programs and services, scholarships, Talk Line, the Back to School store, clothing assistance projects, and intern training programs. Ncjw LA social justice programs provide education and legislative advocacy on issues that affect and impact women, children, and families in many areas. Our programs cover children's rights, economic justice, health care, human trafficking, reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, immigration, and gender-related violence. Additionally, we offer many advocacy events such as this one throughout the year. Our upcoming events can be found in the back of your programs, and here's some of the highlights. April 2nd, we're going to have a program entitled Become a Modern Day Moses, Stop Human Trafficking. Hear survivor stories and learn how you can take action. On April 20th will be a human trafficking outreach night. After training and a rally, volunteers will take to the streets of Los Angeles for a night of outreach against human trafficking. On April 26th, we will be reviewing Audrey and Daisy, a film that is an urgent real-life drama examining the ripple effects on families, friends, schools, and communities when two underage young women find that sexual assault crimes against them have been caught on the camera. The film will be followed by a Q&A with FBI Special Agent Amy Whitman. May 1st and 2nd are our lobby days in Sacramento, where we will go and take our message directly to our state legislators. June 11th, we'll join the Resist March from the LA Pride Project. Ncjw LA is a community partner, and we will be marching with the community from Hollywood to West Hollywood. We encourage everybody to join us with all these events. I think you would agree that this represents an impressive number of programs which serve our community. To assure their continuance, we greatly appreciate donations. If you did not have a chance to contribute but would like to, there is a donation box at the door. By your participation today, you have already taken a step in joining us in our work. You can receive updates on events, social justice issues, legislation, advocacy programs, and services by following us on Facebook at Ncjw Los Angeles and on Twitter at Ncjw LA. Before we begin the program, I want to call attention to the index program cards on each of your seats. Please feel free to use them throughout the program for any questions that you think of that you may wish to ask the panelists. It is now my pleasure to introduce my esteemed colleague, Sandra Fluke, who will be moderating our panel this afternoon. Sandra is on the Board of Directors of Ncjw LA and serves with me as co-chairman of the Advocacy Committee. She is also on the board of Emerge California and on the advisory committees of the Stonewall Democratic Club, West Hollywood Beverly Hills Democratic Club, Westside Family Health Center, and Hollaback, in addition to volunteering as a pro bono attorney. Sandra graduated cum laude from Georgetown Law as a public interest law scholar with a certificate in refugee and humanitarian emergencies, and from Cornell with a degree in public analysis and management. For over a decade, Sandra has devoted her career to legislative and legal advocacy for public interest. She is the California State Director of an advocacy organization where she works on climate change, economic inequality, campaign finance reform, immigration, healthcare, and criminal justice reform. I want to give a warm welcome to Sandra Fluke.
I want to make sure everyone realizes the upcoming events that Roz is reading over are at the back of your program. So you have a listing there, and I would just call your attention to one other thing that's not listed, which is the advocacy committee that we have here at Ncjw that meets once a month and helps to plan a lot of these events and engage in legislative advocacy as well. Our next meeting is April 19th at 7 p.m. That's April 19th at 7 p.m. here at Ncjw. You do not need to be Jewish or a woman or national or council to join. So everyone is welcome at our meetings. And then the one after that is May 10th at 7 p.m. You can, if you're specifically interested in the advocacy committee, you can sign up for that outside at the check-in tables. In addition to just generally signing in, you can write beside your name that you want to be on the advocacy committee. So we'd love to have some of you. So thank you, and thank you for taking time out of your Sunday to join us. I always like to just acknowledge and applaud the fact that you care enough about the future of the country and about our communities to take some of your hard-earned free time and devote it to these kinds of trainings and efforts. So thank you all for being here, for starters. Just so we have a sense of who's in the room, how many of you have ever attended a rally or a protest? Okay, good. We've got a few people who haven't, but most people have. How many of you have organized one and sort of been in charge of it? Ah, that's why you're here. You're ready for the next level, yes? Yeah, that's why you're here? Good. How many of you have engaged in civil disobedience, where you had like a sit-in or an arrest in order to make the point? Okay, good, a few. So we've got a great panel to talk to you today. We've had a series of trainings here at Ncjw. We've been talking about legislative advocacy, about how to do op-eds to newspapers, how to use the media, how to use social media. We're exploring all of our different advocacy tools. And if any of you are interested in those kind of topics, we'll be doing trainings on those later in the year again as well. But we wanted to also make sure we talked about some of the more radical tools in the toolbox, some of the direct action types of things. So protests and rallies, permitted and unpermitted, as well as civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance. And there's just a rich and complex history of the impact that these kinds of tools have been able to have in our country over a number of decades. And I have to say, I've moderated a lot of panels. This is a pretty distinguished panel. You're all in for a treat on these topics today. So without further delay, let me introduce your panelists. To my immediate right is Carol Sobel. I didn't check correct pronunciation of names. Did I get that right? Yeah. Okay, good. Carol is one of the leading First Amendment attorneys nationally in the country. She spent 20 years working in various positions for the ACLU of Southern California, which we have to say is one of the best ACLUs in the country.
The best.
The best. Well, I interned at another one, so I can't be quoted on that. Carol has been involved in numerous significant cases in federal and state courts, including recently on behalf of protesters at the Democratic National Convention, May Day 2007, Occupy LA, and the Free Trade Area of the Americas. She chaired the National Lawyers Guild Mass Defense Committee for many years, helping coordinate a national defense of protesters with Occupy and marshaling legal defense at several Democratic and Republican national conventions. And she's here today representing the National Lawyers Guild. Thank you, Carol. Yes. And to her immediate right is Brendan Hamme. I'm doing so well. Brendan Hamme is a staff attorney at the ACLU of Southern California and was a student of Carol's at one point, if I'm correct. He is in the Orange County office and works on a wide range of civil rights and civil liberties issues, including freedom of speech, prisoners' rights, LGBT rights, voting rights, and students' rights. While attending Loyola Law School, he chaired the ACLU of Loyola and founded the Juvenile Rights Project, a program that brings Loyola students into local high school classrooms to teach the students about their civil rights in police encounters. Thank you so much, Brandon. And next we have Vivian Rothstein. Vivian was introduced to activism through the civil rights movement of the early 1960s. She was a Mississippi Freedom Summer volunteer in 1965. She then became active in the anti-Vietnam War movement, the peace movement. In 1967, she participated in a peace delegation to North Vietnam to witness American bombing of civilian targets. And those of you who work on reproductive rights may remember Jane, the abortion referral service from before Roe v. Wade. She was very active with an organization that helped to set up Jane. She currently works with the Los Angeles Alliance for a New Economy, LANE, and has for the past 18 years. We partner with them here at Ncjw on a number of things. She's also works closely with Unite Here, which is the hotel workers union locally. Thank you for joining us, Vivian. Last but by no means least, we have Reverend William Smart, Jr. He's the president and CEO of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference of Southern California. It's a mouthful. You all may recall that the Southern Christian Leadership Conference is the organization that Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. Led in his historic and famous work. Reverend Smart is also the co-pastor of the Christ Liberation Ministries in Los Angeles, and he's been an advocate and disciple of Dr. King throughout his life. He has participated and worked with various social justice organizations and movements, and worked on behalf of African Americans and all people who have been oppressed in some capacity. Most recently, he served as the National Director of African American Clergy Outreach with Hillary Clinton for president. And he was president of the NAACP in Jackson, a board member of the SCLC in Birmingham, and a number of other amazing positions. Thank you, Reverend Smart. See, I wasn't lying. It's an incredible panel, isn't it? And you have their complete bios in your program. I gave you the highlights. So let's begin by just giving each of our panelists a moment to introduce themselves and say a few words about how they got involved in direct action and what their sort of experiences have been in summary over the years in direct action. Who would like to begin? I'm a non-linear moderator. Vivian, you got it.
Well, my journey started actually in this neighborhood, which used to be populated by mostly Jewish refugees from World War II. And my parents were refugees, and there was a lot of fear in the community and in my family. And when I was a teenager, actually in junior high school, around 14, I joined Hashomer Hatzair, which used to meet 2 blocks down on Fairfax, and part of the goal of that group was to help teach us to be courageous and not fearful. And I was telling Sandra that one of the things that we were asked to do on a Shabbat evening was to scale the fence at Fairfax High School. So every time I go by Fairfax, I remember that. It wasn't that we were going to do any harm. It was to teach us not to be afraid, that we could be strong, particularly the girls, and that we could be courageous, and we could do things that were maybe important to do, and but hard to do. After that, I went to college at Berkeley, and I felt drawn to the civil rights movement, and I worked with the Congress of Racial Equality, also feeling that this was a group of people, African American activists, who were dealing with their fears and overcoming their fears to scale the fence, or whatever, actually scale segregation and racism. And I got trained there in nonviolent civil disobedience, which was very important to me, gave me a philosophy and an approach and a discipline and a strategy and a spiritual foundation for taking action against injustice. And it has really informed everything that I've done since. And of course, when I went to the South, I saw people who were enormously courageous and who found the discipline of nonviolence to be a real support for them in fighting for justice. So I feel like it was formative in my life, and I'm very thankful that I found a way not to be a fearful person and to move with pride and confidence in defending what I believe.
I'd say the lesson choke. Who would like to go next? I will call on you. Brendan?
Sure. So I really got into public interest work generally because I come from a family of Holocaust survivors. Growing up, I heard the stories of my great aunt and my grandfather, who were both survivors of Auschwitz. And their stories left a permanent mark on my mind of the dangers and horrors that unchecked power is capable of unleashing on the world. And so it's through that lens that I came to do this work in particular. I've been involved in multiple movements in my, albeit short career, working for students' rights, working to keep big money out of politics, working on drug policy reform issues. One of the other things that brings me to public interest work is I have Crohn's disease. So I found that medical marijuana was the best treatment for the pain, the nausea, the underlying inflammation. So drug policy reform has been an issue that I've been involved in for quite some time. I became involved in the National Lawyers Guild, primarily under Carol's tutelage. So began doing legal observation at protests, and that brings me to today.
Reverend Smart, would you like to share?
1968 was a big year. That was the year that Dr. Martin Luther King died. I was 9 years old when he died, and I started in the ministry. I declared to my church that I wanted to preach at 9 years old. But at the same time, I declared that I wanted to be an activist. I wanted to do something different. I wanted to be like him and Jesus and my father and just make a difference. And so up the street from where we lived, there was a construction job going on. And one day I walked by on my way from school, and all the workers out there have signs that they are protesting. I started protesting. I grabbed a sign. They said, I just started protesting. And my father, when he got home, he was a member of a union, so he couldn't say anything. He was kind of moved at already. And I said, Daddy, they're being taken, in those words as a kid, I just said, Dad, they're being taken advantage of, and I just got to fight for them. And that created an indomitable spirit in me that lasted all my life until today. So when I wake up, I said, what I'm going to fight for today, every day, especially now. I'm highly motivated now to fight every day.
Carol.
So I'm going to pick up where Reverend Smart left off, because we share the same year as a motivating force, although...
Hold the microphone just a little closer, Carol.
We shared the same year as a motivating force, although I'm a bit older than Reverend Smart. I was in college and graduating in 1968, and I became involved in political activity, first because I took off a lot my senior year, and I was a student organizer and on the National Advance staff for the Eugene McCarthy for President campaign. And everybody recalls, or at least some of you may recall, what happened that summer when the DNC held its nominating convention in Chicago. I was there in Grant Park, and that sort of was my impetus, and I want to share, I was at the memorial for Tom Hayden a few weeks ago, some of you may recall, and one of the things Tom was fond of saying was something happened all over the planet in 1968. So I feel like that was just such a critical year. I went on to work on the moratorium against the war in Vietnam. We held 2 huge rallies, one the largest rally ever on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., and I've been pretty much doing this ever since.
For those of you who may be a little bit younger, Tom Hayden was a leader in the peace movement and a number of other social justice movements, especially in the 60s, but continued that throughout his life, and eventually served as, I believe, a state assembly member and state senator for the area on the west side and around Santa Monica, and passed away just a few months ago. He was an incredible leader who leaves a long legacy of mentorship and accomplishments. So I'd like to begin with sort of the entry level point for folks who may not have ever attended a rally or a protest before and who might feel a little bit nervous about that. Most of the time, if a rally or a protest has a permit, you're going to be fine. You're not going to have any encounters with law enforcement. But some of us may be from communities that are more likely to be profiled by law enforcement, or more likely to have challenges in those situations, especially if we're undocumented or if we're communities of color. So what kind of advice would you share with folks attending rallies and protests for the first time? Whoever would like to answer.
Well, a couple of thoughts, and Vivian grew up here, and so I think Vivian probably remembers, as do I, when protesting in Los Angeles looked a lot different. If you protested in Los Angeles, you were likely to be met with a line of horses, officers on horses. You were likely to be clubbed. The pictures of what went on in Century City in the 60s, when Reagan was our governor, I guess, remain in my mind really strongly. It's not like that anymore in Los Angeles. And
I've never even seen an officer on horseback.
Yeah, they stopped the horseback as a result of a settlement in a lawsuit we had.
There you go.
But they'll have them on the side. We really, from the Democratic Convention in 2000 up through May Day 2007, we really changed how protest activity occurs here in Los Angeles. And back after the Rodney King uprising in 1992, I and two other lawyers spent about 6 months rewriting the Los Angeles Police Department's manual on crowd control with the LAPD. And things changed. It took a little while for that to settle in. But we joke now, I joke, and actually the police department has started picking it up, that Los Angeles is now the safest large city in which to protest. That doesn't mean you don't get arrested, but you no longer get shot with rubber bullets like people did in 2007 was the last time that occurred. You don't get attacked by the horses, and the last time that occurred was the Prop 8 protests. It's just totally different here. So you can assume that you're going to be pretty safe if you go to a protest, quite frankly. And you don't need a permit to demonstrate if you're responding to spontaneous events. So let's say, for example, Donald Trump gets elected president and everybody goes out into the streets. As you saw, that went on for days. 400 people got arrested, but mostly what people get arrested for now in Los Angeles is blocking a freeway entrance. That is always going to be a problem. So if you want to go out and protest, you don't want to get arrested, stay away from the freeway entrances. That's the best advice I can give people. You don't need a permit to protest on a sidewalk. You just need to keep half the sidewalk open so that people can get by. These are all issues that when I was at the ACLU and since, we've all litigated to really open up protest activity here, the safe protest activity here in Los Angeles. I always suggest, though, that you listen for dispersal orders, whether that dispersal order is legal or not. It's not an argument you want to have on the street. Okay?
So a dispersal order meaning the police saying you need to disperse, you need to leave this area.
So as a result of the settlement in one of our cases, the police have to accommodate people being in the streets, but they're only going to do that up to a certain point. So they're going to allow you to be in the streets and block traffic for a couple of hours, maybe 1 or 2 days, and then they're going to put an end to it. So people should just be aware of that. But they will accommodate a lot of that. We have a lot of freedom here to protest in Los Angeles, and as I said, it's gotten pretty safe.
And sometimes folks ask, well, why would you go to the freeway anyway? What does Donald Trump have to do with the freeway entrance? You all know the answer to this. That's how you get on the news.
Right. It's no business as usual.
Right. And so sometimes pushing those boundaries is what gets the media attention, which can be a very powerful tool. But you can also, and this is where I think some of the strategy comes in, you can also really annoy some angry commuters. Yeah. So you have to decide whether what you're doing is advancing your movement or potentially hurting your cause in how it's portrayed. And those are always the difficult tactical decisions. Brendan, you look like you have some advice for folks if they're going to a protest that, you know, might not be a permitted women's march that, you know, is totally, there's not going to be problems there, but other types.
Sure. So, sorry about that. You know, the first thing that I want to point out is that freedom of speech is for everybody. It doesn't matter your religious beliefs, your viewpoints or opinions, your race or ethnicity, or your immigration status. First Amendment rights are available to everybody. If it's your first time being involved in a protest, you know, you do want to assess what your comfort level is. So know what the dividing line is between, and I suspect we'll get to this a little bit later, between protected free speech and nonviolent civil disobedience, where you are consciously accepting the consequences of your actions. And know what kind of liability you're opening yourself up to. If you are planning a protest where you're going to be blocking the streets and you don't have a permit to do that, realize what kind of fines you might be subject to. And if that's a situation that's going to expose you to contact with law enforcement, then you should know what impact that might have on you if you have outstanding warrants, if you're not documented, things like that to be aware of. And then there's a question in the audience.
Oh, let's actually, I should have announced this at the beginning, I apologize. There are index cards on your chairs where you can write down your questions. And we will have folks pick those up and we will address them at the end of the panel. So we're not going to take the questions right now, but we will make sure to get to them at the end. Thank you. So Brendan, I thought you had an excellent point in saying that it doesn't matter what your immigration status is, you still have a right to free speech, but an understanding of what the consequences may be if you come into contact with law enforcement, if you're undocumented or if you have past warrants and things like that. Because I've had folks ask me that, am I allowed to attend a protest if I'm a green card holder? Am I allowed to be there if I have these kinds of immigration statuses? So I think that's an excellent point. Pastor Smart, looked like you wanted to add something.
I want to come from the other side of this. I think there are times when spontaneous civil disobedience is important. And even during that moment, you have to know how far to go. If you remember a couple of years ago when they had Trayvon Martin's decision came out, and the African American community was part of the Latino and other progressive whites were just upset. And so they started marching, and we were all marching together. Some people veered onto the highway. And I remember we just said, be careful when you go out there. That was a dramatic moment. It does stop traffic. It does get cameras. But most importantly, you're making a statement that you're fed up. And I think in every protest, there ought to be a moment when you are fed up. Now, when you get out there, I've learned, let me back up. Just like Carol, he has a relationship to Carol, I have a relationship with Vivian. She hired me at Lane, so when I worked there. So we both got hired by these ladies, brother. So
every good man has been.
And one of the things, having worked at Lane, we always had these beautiful choreographed actions when it was the farm workers, if it was the grocery workers, beautiful. You meet with the police, you organize the detail, where you're going to go, all of that. That's fine, permits in place. But when it's just a spur of the moment of frustration, I think even then you have to think. Like, I didn't go in the highway that day, but some of the people I said, when you get out there, don't stay long and get out before the cops really get upset. What I have learned, and Carol, correct me if I'm wrong, the cops will give you a period. And when that period is over, they did it recently after the Trump election. They give you a period. When that period is over, scurry out the way so you don't get arrested. Because usually we don't have the money for the bail.
I think we saw the power of that with the airport protests recently when the immigration order that impacted refugees came through and folks just spontaneously and started showing up at the airports, and the way that drove the media coverage, that was really instrumental in changing where we are on that executive order conversation. Very powerful. Vivian, I know you wanted to describe sort of where we are with the LA police right now, I believe. Was it
could.
you and I who were talking about the
Yes,
detente?
well, no, I agree with Carol that, especially right now, we're out on the street a lot around federal policy. And the Los Angeles Police Department is not, and, doesn't really influence, it can influence federal policy, but they're not our targets. And because of the political environment where we have a progressive majority on the city council, it isn't just the police department making its own decisions. There is a city council that is sympathetic to progressive protests about concerns about, including police brutality, but many of the federal policy issues that are coming down around the Affordable Care Act and others. So they're not our enemy. They're not the target. Our target really is to influence the hearts and minds of the entire American population about the issues that we care about. So that has something to do with how you comport yourself, how you look, and the chants that you use, and the leaflets that you pass out. Most ordinary Americans don't respond necessarily to uncontrolled rage. That doesn't necessarily reach their hearts. You really need to make, for instance, someone getting deported, make their life and their humanity something that they can understand. Share their stories. Share the stories of people whose lives are getting damaged by the policies that we are opposing. So that's really, it isn't just the media. Of course, the media reaches many, many people, but it's how we come across on the media and whether our message comes across and whether that message is something that an ordinary American can understand.
Absolutely. You and Reverend Smart both touched on that there are ways that we have an opportunity here in Los Angeles to work with law enforcement and to work with elected officials. Reverend Smart, you referenced sending in a delegation initially. Can you talk about some of the strategies of who do you go to if you need a permit? Which level of government do you go to? What are the steps when you reach out to law enforcement initially and to the government?
Well, coming from a labor perspective, there is a labor detail that in the police department, and the planning when we do a labor action, we will meet with that labor detail to talk to them about what we want to do, where we want to go, the time, and everything like that. That labor detail acts as a buffer between us and the police department and basically the city. In that regard. So just in that area only is the only time I've worked with a permit. When we've done other non-labor actions, we have not had permits. We have just gone out there, we've done it, and staying on sidewalks or different things. But then when the rage has hit us, and those situations where we spontaneous action, combustion, I want to say, we just hit the streets. And police have come, and in the Merck Park, which has been the scene of a lot of things, I can tell you there's something that happened one time. They were out there. It was about after the same time when Trayvon's death, and there was over 500 people out there just protesting. The police were on the perimeter. So another radical group comes up. A lot of them are intoxicated and everything, and they're getting in the face of the police. So me and another Pastor Sauls from Holman, we jumped in between them because we didn't want, everything was sensitive. We didn't want another black man shot that weekend. And we just told them, back up, no, get out of face. You defending the police. No, we're protecting your life. Then we turned around and the police had backed all the way out of the park. And they said, we saw that you guys had it. We didn't want to get in the way. We appreciate that. And those cops from that day, we had a great relationship from then on.
Yeah.
Because they saw that we wanted our people protected, honestly, from them.
Well, let me come back to Carol to answer the question around permits and different types of land, and then I want to touch on what
the police commission has responsibility for permits, and there are some officers, sergeant level officers, who work with the police commission downtown. If you're downtown, it's Sergeant Jim Baker, and most of the time, we meet with them beforehand, much as you would with the labor group, to work out any, tell them what our expectations are, work out any issues. We don't work with them if people want to engage in civil disobedience, because most often people don't want to tell the police before they get there what they're going to do. And we've had the police come up to us at different times and say, well, if you had just told us. I said, well, our clients didn't want to tell you because they wanted to engage in civil disobedience and not have you block their opportunity to do that. But the police are, as I said, they're working a lot to facilitate with the post-Trump arrests, and we've really built, I'm with the National Lawyers Guild more now, and if you're out and you demonstrate, the people with the lime green hats that are out there, we interface, but we don't represent. We communicate between the police and the demonstrators if the demonstrators want us to do that. Otherwise, we're just there to observe. But we've worked out different things. And let me just go back a minute, if I could, to something Reverend Smart said. You don't usually post bail when you're released. We have a cite and release statute in California. You're supposed to be released OR. The police stopped doing that a number of years ago around Occupy and some other stuff, and after paying a lot of money in settlements, they now are back to doing cite and release. So if you go in, don't post bail. You're going to be out in a few hours. It just isn't worth it to put up the money, because if you post 10% bail, you lose the money. So you either have to post full cash bail or get or 10%, and 10% means you lose that money. You'll get out really quickly. A lot of times, what happens now is if you are arrested, the city won't prosecute you if it's your first time. They'll give you a slap on the wrist city attorney hearing unless you did something like break a window. But if it's only something like failure to disperse or something like that, you're going to get off the first time. However, if you then get arrested again within the time period that charge is live, which might be a year, that's what they usually tell you, they might go back and prosecute you on the first charge as well. But for the most part, they won't do that. With the post-Trump arrests, we were concerned that a lot of people who were out there were not documented. A lot of DACA students were out there. We were very concerned about the immigration impact of even having a charge that is filed on people. And we worked with the police department, and they agreed that they would not file a misdemeanor on anyone unless they had done something like, smashed a police window or something like that, car window, because of what Sandra said, the concern that everybody shares about not facilitating the Trump policies at this point. So, as I said, it's not bad if you get arrested, quite frankly. I was arrested once by accident when I was an ACLU lawyer out there at a May Day thing. Well, it wasn't by accident, it was deliberate on the part of the sergeant, who then said, oh my God, he was actually going around, I got an ACLU lawyer. And I'll tell you what the worst part of it was. I represented the RCP, the Revolutionary Communist Party, for years, but I managed to never meet them. And I was on a bus with them. And then in a cell with them. So sort of blew my cover.
Well, as you can tell from Carol's remarks, there's a lot of detail and there's a lot of expertise that you want to have before engaging in some of these actions. So one good best practice to take note of is that if you have folks who want to get arrested or want to engage in civil disobedience, call the National Lawyers Guild before you engage in that action. And there are other attorneys who are also willing to step forward and play that role. Don't call your real estate attorney. They're not equipped. Call some folks who have worked in this area, and NLG will send folks out in the green hats, as you said, for these kinds of actions. So it's important to just think these things through before engaging in them, and to consult with attorneys and have the kind of assistance that you need.
And there are also, there are also organizations like the Ruckus Society that specialize in trainings for nonviolent civil disobedience. So if that's something that you're seriously contemplating, they're always a resource as well.
Excellent, thank you. Yes, Vivian?
Yeah, in your packet, there's a sheet that, getting arrested is not the only nonviolence and
Right.
disobedience opportunity that's open to you. There's many different tactics, and being creative to get your message across. Don't just say, oh, I'm gonna go, that's the only thing to do is to get arrested. There's many ways to interact with civil society and express your view, be oppositional and nonviolent and effective at the same time. So there's 198 suggestions. They're not all relevant, but I think it expands our creativity and our thinking about what's possible at this moment to get our message across.
That's right. I wanted to go back to the description that Reverend Smart was giving of a different group with a different kind of agenda showing up. And sometimes they're there to delegitimize your efforts. So sometimes if you're trying to have a peaceful effort, there are people who actually oppose you, who come in and try to get violent, to give your movement a bad name, or to cause trouble and scare people off from your movement. And sometimes you also, especially as women or as other vulnerable communities, may have just a one person individually harassing you in this situation. What are some of the things that you would recommend in those kinds of situations? Vivian, I know you and I were talking about the one-on-one.
First I would suggest that you go to a demonstration with a small group so that there's a number of you that are looking out for each other, and you have more than two sets of eyes. And if you start seeing someone who's troublesome or trying to stir up trouble in a demonstration, trying to create conflict, your group is together and you can get out of danger. One other option is to surround someone in the way that Reverend Smart mentioned, or separate them from the group. But I noticed, for instance, on the Women's March, there were a group of 3 anarchists who were going through the crowd. And I don't think they did anything. They were dressed, all in black. You couldn't see their faces. But so there are times when other groups think that creating violence or creating conflict is more politically potent, and you just have to really be aware. So if you're with a group, a small group, and you know each other and you can look out for each other, if anyone starts getting harassed, you can surround that person to protect them. You can help the group move out of danger. And you can also keep yourself from buying into being agitated. I've been in many demonstrations, including Grant Park in Chicago, where there were agents of, I think it was the Chicago police, who were saying, get the pigs, get the pigs, get the pigs. And as soon as you saw someone saying something like that, you really needed to think about who they were and whether they were speaking in the interests of the demonstrators, which they were not. So there are provocateurs sometimes, and it seems paranoid to say that, but believe me, there are people who don't want our demonstrations to look sane. They don't want them to look rational, and they want us to be scared and to maybe get hurt. So I think a group is extremely important, and to talk beforehand of how you're going to stick together and work with each other. And if it's a larger group, maybe have buddies, so there's two and two, so that you always have each other's, you always know where the other person is and they know where you are. And also to let your family or a friend know where you are at the demonstration, when you're expected back, so that people know if you didn't show up when you were supposed to.
And one of the good pieces of advice that I've heard, if you're going to a situation where you think it might be more confrontational, is, all of us are so reliant on our phones, and you may get separated from your phone. So making sure that you actually have memorized important phone numbers or have them written somewhere, not just in your phone, and that you have some other opportunities for how you're going to communicate with folks. You have your ID actually physically on you rather than in a backpack, things like that, if you're going into a situation that may be challenging. Reverend Smart.
Answering the first part of your question, what happens when your movement or your protest is being co-opted by someone, how to prevent that? Mm-hmm. Several things we've done in the past is, first of all, if it's your movement, you put out literature to everybody and to, even the authorities, and let them know what your cause is, what your mission is, what you intend to do that day. Then have everyone coordinated, shirts and makes whoever's giving out the shirts knows a group that knows everybody, so they are giving your shirts or pins only to the people that are part of your movement, your protest. So that's important, so that if something breaks out or something starts, it's not your people that are the ones that are behind it, because you have defined your movement, you have given the reasons you're out there, and you're letting everyone know we're in these colors, this is us. So when some provocateurs come, you just say, hey, that's them. That's not us. We're here. And then train your people so that they respond. They know how to keep moving. They know not to follow that crowd, continuously follow the leaders of your movement. Those are just some of the things.
Great
There's
tips.
others.
And speaking of identifying the leaders, I've participated in actions where, especially around things like sexual violence, where we had different colored armbands. And so one armband was for survivor, one armband was for ally, one armband, different colors. One color was for the folks who are the organizers and the leaders. So if you have some way, whether it's an armband or a different colored t-shirt or something on the t-shirt, so that people know who are the leaders and the organizers. If I have a question, if I need something, who do I go to in that kind of a situation? And if you identify folks like survivors, if you're talking about a sexual violence situation, you know how to be appropriately sensitive that someone may have traumatic flashbacks or may have real emotional reactions to those situations. Now, there may be other scenarios in which you really don't want to identify what role you're playing, so you don't want to say the people with this armband are undocumented and the people with this armband are not. That's probably a bad idea, depending on your scenario. So what are the ways that those of us who are perhaps more privileged or less vulnerable can be allies in these situations? Most of the time the ACLU attorney's not getting arrested, but if I see a young man of color who's having a bad interaction with the police, or I see an immigrant who I'm concerned about what's happening with them and a police officer, or I see a woman being harassed, what are the ways that we should and should not intervene?
So I would strongly recommend against intervening if an officer is engaged with someone. I just stand a safe enough distance away, try to document what's going on, but not engage, because you might find yourself charged for interfering with an officer, and you certainly don't want that. So, stand back and monitor. If it's not a situation quite like that, and I've done this.
And what do you mean by document?
Well, if you have a cell phone, take video of it. If you think there are people around who know the person, try to talk to them, get the name of the individual, try to figure out what happened, get witness statements from people, but don't interfere with the officer. So that's what I would do. But if I had, and I've done this before with kids who are Black Bloc, if they come out to a demonstration, I've done this a lot.
What do you mean by black?
The kids who are all in black, at demonstrations with the black pennants and the black face masks. And they become an immediate target for the police, even though most, they, like everyone else, are not going to engage in anything that's unlawful activity. They just, to the police, trigger a response. And when I've been out at a demonstration and I see the police focusing on them, I will take a group of legal observers or other volunteers and surround them, so that, but I'll ask them first if they want it, if they want us to help them, so that the police don't come after them. And in some situations, we've then, escorted them out of the demonstration. I try to see if there's a situation that's occurring that's not safe, that's threatens somebody's safety, and if we can somehow protect them and move them out of the danger zone. So that's a lot of what I would recommend that people do. But I'm not recommending you do the surrounding thing if you don't. If you don't usually do that, find somebody who's the leader of the demonstration or the leaders of the demonstration and try to bring it to their attention as well. Can I just say one quick thing? I want to support Vivian's paranoia because I share it about agent provocateurs. I've had a lot of experience with them. I worked at the ACLU when the ACLU was infiltrated. We used to have red squads here in Los Angeles. I've been in databases maintained when they couldn't do it by the police anymore, that they put it in private databases. So, and I've had it happen at major demonstrations before, and so I really share Vivian's paranoia, because when we've gone and sued afterwards and gotten a lot of documentation, we always have found out that who we thought was the agent was in fact the agent. And we used to have a great activist here in Los Angeles, Dave Dinsmore. I don't know if anybody knew him or remembered him. He was a really, really great guy. And we would go out to demonstrations together, and he was a small guy and not very imposing. And if we identified somebody we thought was a police infiltrator, Dave would go up to him and just be really chatty and say, "Hey, I've seen you around here a lot. What do you do? Why are you here during the day?" You know, and the guy would inevitably walk away, and we'd see him get into a police car.
You know, two of the things that come through in Carol's points to me are just walking up to somebody and asking some questions. So in the example she just gave, but also if you're concerned about somebody and you want to be an ally, if you're worried about them, just going over and saying, "Are you okay? Are you feeling safe? Are you feeling okay? Is there anything I can do to help?" That just opens things up. You know, so often in so many situations we think we don't know how to help, and the key is to just ask the community that's in need, and they will know what they need, and they will tell us what they need. Reverend Smart and also Brendan, I think, wanted to chime in.
To answer your question, what happens if you see someone being attacked?
Oh, you've got the app out.
The ACLU app. You know, get it on your phone, and you can record what's going on, and it immediately goes to them. If they smash your phone, it's already there. So this is it. This is modernization for justice.
This is called Mobile Justice California is what you want to look for when you download the app. I already have it. It's Mobile Justice California. It's the ACLU app. And the key is, the reason this is better than just taking your own video is that if your phone is then taken as evidence or taken in an altercation or something, the video has already been transmitted. So it protects the video and makes sure it gets to the ACLU. And you can use this in instances if you see police harassment happening, or you see other things, not even in the protest context, but in other situations, and you want to communicate that. Brendan.
The Reverend took the words right out of my mouth.
Oh, yeah, that's right. You're plugging your app.
So.
What, slack it off. You're plugging your app.
So, I mean, there's other benefits to the app as well. It uploads to our servers, as they said, right after the video's finished being taken. You can also notify other people around who have the app on their phones. So it'll send a signal to their phone indicating that there's a altercation with the police or interaction with the police. And it will tell you where that interaction is taking place so that you can also go and observe. Getting an incident from multiple angles is always going to be for the better. You know, as Carol indicated, you have a First Amendment right to record the police when they're in a public place and performing their public duties. They do not like it, but you know, that's why it's important to do it.
Well, I was just going to ask if you would continue on with what are some of the other rights that people should know that they have, and what types of speech are protected, and what types of speech might be more challenging if you engage in them?
Sure. I'll back up just a second. You know, in terms of interactions with the police, everybody should know they have the right to remain silent. You should say out loud, "I'm going to remain silent and I'd like to talk to an attorney." The Supreme Court, for whatever reason, has decided that in order to actually remain silent, you have to speak up. I'm not here to tell you what the law says, or I'm here to tell you what the law says, not what the law should be. You also have the right to refuse consent to searches. So an officer asks you to open up your bag so they can take a look. They ask you to take off your shoes, turn out your pockets. What they're doing is asking you for your consent to a search. And you should say, "Officer, I don't consent to searches." When an officer first comes up to you, they can only detain you if they have reasonable suspicion or probable cause. And the way to test that, you know, is to ask, "Officer, am I being detained or am I free to go?" And the officer says, "Yes, you're free to go," or "Well, I just want to ask you a few questions." That means that they don't have what they need to legally detain you, and you should feel free to walk away. If they continue to ask you questions, continue to ask, officer, am I being detained or am I free to go? There will come a point where a reasonable person wouldn't feel free to go, at which point you are being detained, and that's when you should invoke all of your other rights.
Like your right to remain silent, your right to speak with an attorney, things
Yep,
like that.
and your right to refuse searches.
And so, if a police officer comes up to you at a protest or a rally or something, and they just start talking to you, what's the best approach? If they're not trying to arrest you, they're just asking you questions about why you're there, what's going on.
I mean, it's your call. I think that it's always best to be polite to the officer, at least in the first instance. Hello, officer, how are you doing? Oh, I'm doing well. But beyond that, you don't have to interact with the police unless they have reasonable suspicion or probable cause. So you can say, like I said earlier, officer, am I being detained or am I free to go? Or, officer, I have somewhere else to be. And then politely and slowly walk away.
And so then touching on the speech question, what are the areas of protected speech and what types of speech do you want to just understand what you're doing if you engage in them?
Sure. So there are categories of speech that aren't protected by the First Amendment, but those are very narrowly defined. So something like incitement. If you are calling on people to, in that moment, break a specific law or engage in violence, that's not going to be protected speech.
So if you're
Carol,
standing in front of a building
okay.
saying, let's light it on fire.
Yes, exactly. Something like extortion, if you stand next to somebody and say, give me your money or I'll shoot, that's not protected under the First Amendment. Something like obscenity, which in the context of a protest and a demonstration, suffice it to say, unless you're planning on playing hardcore pornography at your demonstration, not going to be an issue. You should know what defamation is. So defamation, it has to be a false statement of fact, and it has to damage somebody's reputation. And then when you're dealing with a public figure, or talking about a public issue, you can't be punished for something unless you said it recklessly. So if you knew it was false or you just didn't care whether or not it was false. So you do have broad protections under the First Amendment to criticize public officials. That's really the highest purpose, or among the highest purposes of the First Amendment. You have the right to speak truth to power, petition for redress of grievances, and criticize public officials up to, and sometimes most importantly, the President of the United States.
So give us some examples with, President Trump, of some things that, might get a big reaction but are totally protected to say, whereas some other things that you might win the case but you might end up in court.
Sure. I think that, one of the biggest examples is somebody should shoot the president. That's sort of a broad statement. That doesn't fall under the category of incitement or a true threat. You're just saying that at some indeterminate point in the future, somebody should do this. I'll give another example. Advocating for violent overthrow of the U.S. government. If that is kind of reasonably specific and has a definite time frame, that could be considered treason. So if you want to engage in a chant, I think something appropriate might be, what do we want? Violent revolution. When do we want it? At some indeterminate point in the future. No, Carol disagrees.
I think you could ask for it now, and it wouldn't. You're on the street. You're engaged in protest activity. I've represented people who had much more direct contact. When Saddam Hussein was hanged, there were approximately 1,300 people who posted on the internet that the wrong president had been hanged, meaning Bush. An activist here in Los Angeles was one of the people, and the next thing he knew, the Secret Service was at his house. And he's a lawyer, he knew his rights, and so he said, get off my property. And so he called the local police department to get the Secret Service off his property, and the Secret Service called the local police department at the same time and said, well, you're this credible threat against President Bush. Police show up, and the police say that they will get the Secret Service off his property after he answers their questions. And my client said, I don't think so. He wound up arrested and criminally charged. We had to go to court, and I have to tell you, the judge was laughing. This was a hearing that went on the entire day, because I filed an immediate motion to throw out the charges. This hearing went on all day long. It was like a 6-hour hearing, and the judge was laughing and just kept going through it because it was so
At the
ridiculous.
government, the judge thought that the
right.
Secret Service were being ridiculous.
Right, right. But, so I think the really, the point is, Brendan's absolutely right, although I think you can make a much more immediate threat and not have a problem.
It was mostly for laughs.
Yeah, and right, and we're seeing now, the Twitter president going after Snoop Dogg for that video that he did where the clown at the end, shoots the bang thing. You have pretty wide latitude, you really do. But if you, but there's always a but to this. But if you post on the internet, neither Brendan nor I can promise you that the Secret Service isn't going to come out to visit you or some local law enforcement agency not because what you did was unlawful, but because they don't understand the law.
Yes.
Okay? So, if you don't want to engage with them, you might think twice about what you post. But if you post and you get called, call Brendan or call me. And we'll show up. I've done this with, I've done FBI interviews, Secret Service, and it's, these people are nuts. These people are so focused and so ununderstanding of what the law is, actually.
Vivian, you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something might be legal, but is it effective?
Right.
I think that our use of our free speech rights, it can be just to blow off steam, but really they have a much higher purpose, and that's to communicate something that really can inspire the rest of our country to rise up. And so I think when we think of speech, I think it's very important that it's protected, but I think for all of us as change makers, we want to think about what is the purpose? What am I trying to accomplish with this speech, with this sign, with this chant? Who do I think I'm going to reach? So I think that's true of all of our activism, to try to think about what is the larger purpose of what we're trying to do, because we want to be effective. We don't want to just use it as therapy, to feel good or to feel less bad. We really want to make a change.
Reverend Smart.
Yeah, thank you, Vivian. I think every speech and every protest should have a mission or something we're out there to accomplish that day. It could be, protests and sit-ins and different things, all are part of a movement. And right now in America, we are in a movement building. Hopefully everyone in this room is the same movement. And so every speech, every piece of energy we utilize right now ought to be toward a goal. And really that goal is to change this government. And I believe the government ought to be overthrown. But there's a way to overthrow the government. It has set up, and that is to throw the bums out of office. That's the way we do that by voting, and that's a protest. Our vote is a protest sometimes. Right now, we need to be taking names of people who are not in the U.S. Senator, who is going with this administration. They're getting any congresspersons. We need to be organized around this land. Those of us like-minded. I'm talking about, African Americans, Jewish brothers and sisters. It's time for us to get that old coalition, Vivian, back together and say, we're not going to take this. Because they're talking about cutting the agriculture department, that's moved HUD, all the programs. Meals on Wheels is just the tip of the iceberg, baby. They're talking about if they get away with what they want, the America we know won't be here.
Fired up, ready to go. So let's talk about getting the band back together. Let's talk about the history of the Jewish community and the African American community working together for civil rights, because I know one of the things folks want to hear about today is the principles of nonviolence, and what is the philosophy of Dr. King and other practitioners of nonviolence, and how can that speak to us today?
Well, first of all, one of the things that King had a 4-point strategy program, and you best see it in his letter from the Birmingham jail, where he says that if there was, the first thing he and even today we do is if there's a discrimination, if there's something going on, you have to investigate. And I've learned I've been a civil rights activist long enough to have been burnt by people, if I curtail that moment and we don't investigate, you can be very embarrassed when you go before some government official, some legislative body. You have to always investigate. Secondly, after investigation, you try to negotiate. He laid this out talking to the ministers from the Birmingham jail, his famous letter. He said, we did the investigation. He said, then we did the negotiation, and we thought we had a deal. They took down some of the signs. 10 days later, the signs of no blacks here were back up. So he said they did the investigation. So he said then you go through self-purification. That is the time when you look at yourself and you get ready for action. You get ready. You get in the mindset. You want is this the right thing to do? Is this the right strategy to do? And then you say, okay, we're going to do it non-violently. So you go to training so that, and Vivian was just talking about, they were in some trainings yesterday. They conducted a nonviolent training yesterday. And you go through the harshness of these trainings so that you get your people ready. And then the fourth thing is a direct action. And he says in the letter, and all of the direct action is, it could be a protest, a boycott, one of these things here, it doesn't matter, but that's when change comes from because people respond in some capacity to direct action. So those 4 things. So along the line, when you look in the greater scope of his work, there are a lot of from Rabbi Heschel, a lot of key Jewish leaders along the line was embracing his movement, part of the civil rights in SCLC. They were members of SCLC. Why? Because it was nonviolent. He would not have been the hero, he would not have a national holiday had he ever done anything violent. But the oxymoron was, it was violence. When as a strategy to put young kids in the streets with fire hose and dogs, that was a violent action. And I went to college in Birmingham, Alabama. I was a member of that SCLC chapter. Years later, 2 of those kids I went to school had been in the streets. They weren't right. You talking about the crazies. These kids they had been in the civil rights, they had been through that. They would have done anything in the name of a good cause. And I say they weren't right. They were ready to fight every day. So I'm saying that was a strategy. I think it had a positive effect because I used to sit down and talk with them. But I'm just simply saying that it was the nonviolence that really moved people close to this movement, because we are all fearful of violence. Even when you said, you use it as just an example of, when you said overthrow the government with violent force, that I cringe because they got all the guns. I told black folks every time when they want to say, let's take over let's go about. No, they got you might have a gun, they got a millimeter cannon at you. You can never get accomplishment with violence. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Thank you. I think the point of that you escalate strategically in your actions. So that's one of the things I wanted to touch on today is that the investigation point is so key of having your facts right, knowing what's really going on, and especially here in Los Angeles where we have so many elected officials and decision makers who are often amenable and sympathetic to the concerns that we're raising. There are so many ways to get things done before escalating to some of these other strategies, and sometimes you have to go there, but the most productive way is often to go one step at a time. Is the fastest way to get to your desired outcome. Folks are coming around and collecting your questions and cards. Oh my gosh, there's a stack and a half. All right. So if you have more questions and they haven't gotten them, just raise your card up and they'll come to you. So we'll start answering those in just a moment. Let me just ask each of the panelists if there's anything they want to add before we go to the questions. Vivian?
Yeah, I just want to echo how important it is that you're here today. There's nothing more important than how we all use our time and what we devote our time to. And the only way to transform this nation is by individuals making a commitment to make activism a part of our lives and to figure out the issues that we feel we can make an impact on and who we can work with. Because many people have said to me, well, tell me who to call. Mm-hmm. Tell me, well, there is no one to call. There is no infrastructure that can really encompass a mass movement. And we're in the moment, as William said, that we're in the moment of the development of a mass mm-hmm. movement that I have never seen in my life. And the only way it will sustain itself is that we create groups of accountability and mutual respect that are serious about taking action, and that we keep those groups together, and that we can continue to add people to those groups, and we may affiliate with a network, but it's our responsibility to hold those units together, because you can't do this alone. It's just, for all your great intentions, all of our great intentions, you can't do it alone. You need to work with other people, and that's actually part of the belief in of Dr. King, is the belief in building a beloved community. And that's where I have found a beloved community, is through progressive action together. So it has a lot of benefits in your life besides making the world a better place.
Excellent point. So, Carol, you wanted to add something?
Well, I was just following up on that. We live in a world where we have a president who talks about making America great again. And it makes me think about a speech that Dr. King gave the day before he was assassinated in Memphis, where he was talking about First Amendment rights. And he said somewhere, I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest for a right. And that's what I think this is all about.
I was playing that on my way here when I was in the driveway.
So one of the first cards that came up here to me was, why doesn't Pastor Smart run for president? He'd be so incredibly effective and inspirational. And I just want to make clear that we're a 501c3 here at National Council of Jewish Women, and we cannot endorse any candidate for political office. One of the other questions on this card is, do you need a permit for spontaneous protest?
No. And spontaneous protest, different cities have different descriptions of it, but usually, most of them try to enforce this rule that it has to be something that occurs within like 5 days of the time that you want to protest. I just sort of ignore that. And I think that we've had a lot of spontaneous protests here. If you think back, when the grand jury came back in Ferguson and refused to indict the officer, we had spontaneous protests in the street. When Trump was elected, spontaneous protests in the street. When the Ferguson protests occurred in Missouri last year, spontaneous protests in the street. Same thing when Prop 8, spontaneous protests. So this is a city where they've really accommodated a lot of that. Santa Monica, because of litigation that we did, has, also allows for spontaneous protests. You just don't really need a permit anywhere. for anything that is going to react to what's occurring so quickly.
What is the specific difference between a regular demonstration and nonviolent civil disobedience? Just a definitional question.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's a First Amendment protected protest is one where you are acting within the rights that are guaranteed under the Constitution or the statutes of California, the California Constitution. Nonviolent civil disobedience, it's when you consciously break the law to call attention to a great injustice.
What about confrontations with people who feel differently than you do? How do you deal with these? So I think many of us have been to rallies and marches and protests where the other side shows up too, or maybe sometimes we are the ones going to somebody else's protest and saying, well, actually we disagree with what their voice is. What are some of your advice for dealing with those situations?
You mean at a demonstration?
Sure, yeah. Like, for example, at the airport, there were people on the other side of the road at the airport there in support of President Trump on the refugee order, for example.
I personally think it's very important to treat everyone in the way that you would want to be treated. So the opposition, to treat people with respect, to say, I hear you, I don't agree with you, I hear you. Not to make, people are not the enemy. They are not the enemy. And having a conflict with them is not going to change their minds. A pastor that I work with, Reverend Jim Kahn, goes I guess it's every Tuesday down at the Federal Building, and people scream from their cars, and he screams something back, have a good day. I respect you. You know, may God be with you. Because why get into a screaming match with someone? And it can be very disarming, actually. Because actually we do respect them. They are human beings, they have a right to their views. So I think that one-to-one screaming match is really totally useless and self-defeating, personally.
And the First Amendment recognizes the right of counter-protesters and counter-demonstrators. The best solution to speech that we don't like isn't to call for censorship, it's more speech. In terms of rights of counter-protesters, they have to be allowed within a reasonable distance of the group that they're protesting in order to make their message heard.
Question?
I was president of the Student Government Association at Miles College in Birmingham, Alabama. I invited the Grand Wizard of the Alabama Klan to come to the school to speak. The president tried to stop me. I did it anyway. He got there. He spoke. I told him, let's respect him. He has a right to speak, and he has a right to be here because I invited him. That evening, there were more kids in the library studying, doing everything than ever before. Why? Because he told them what he wanted to do to take away their rights. He was running for mayor of the city. He told them what he wanted to do. So every now and then, the alternative voice can empower you to do what you need to do.
Yeah, and if we remember the example of this demonstration recently in Berkeley where this right-wing commentator, so the news coverage was nothing about his message. It was all about the people who were trying to prevent him from speaking. It was so counterproductive.
Yeah, I think that's the thing to really think through is what are you accomplishing if you're choosing to be the counter-protest, for example? Because sometimes what you're accomplishing is drawing more attention to a protest that would have gotten no press, no coverage if you hadn't shown up. So you don't necessarily want to throw gas on the fire in those situations. But I do think sometimes there are moments when it's very important that a message not go unanswered. So I think about the situation of a college campus. Let's say there's on my college campus back in the day, there was an anti-choice protest on campus that had some very graphic, very awful images comparing abortion to genocide. And that was very difficult for women who had had abortions to need to walk past. And so we had a counter-protest, a silent, respectful one that we did not engage with the other side, but we had folks present with clearly identifiable T-shirts, and we had counselors there if somebody needed to talk. So it was a way of saying on our campus, you're not unsafe on our campus, and you can have support in this moment, and we will not allow speech that is hurtful to you and hateful to go unanswered. So I think it's always a question, a very thoughtful question of strategy, whether or not to counter things. Another audience question: as an organizer, how do you deal with your allies going off message at protests or rallies? The notorious off message ally. You shake your head. That's the best answer.
A really well-organized action is when the allies get together and come up with the message. And it may not be the message of everything you believe in, but it's the message for that day and that action. And then pick your spokespeople and train your spokespeople. So it isn't just anybody talking to the media. Because you want people who really represent the issue and represent the consensus of your group. You can't always control it, but it's really good to make an effort to do that. And if you're trying to get notable people to speak, they're much more comfortable if you give them talking points so that they know that they're on message with the action. If they just show up with the action, no one has briefed them, they have no idea what they're supposed to say. It's really a disservice to them. But things happen.
You know, I've had a few allies go off message a time or two. I may have even gone off message once or twice. I think that you have to sometimes step back, because when you're organizing an action, when you're really deep in a movement, you can get really, really focused on exactly what the right message is and exactly how we're trying to make our case, and sometimes it can become bigger in your mind than it is to those watching. So you have to be careful that you're not making a bigger deal out of something being off message than it actually is. And again, think about, are you drawing more attention to something than if you just left it alone? So sometimes there'll be something that really crosses the line and the next speaker up has to say, you know, I appreciate your point of view, but not all of us agree with that, and then just keep going. But you have to think strategically whether or not it's appropriate or whether or not it's useful to draw more attention to it. But I think in most rallies and most actions, people understand that each speaker is speaking for themselves. And if they're representing an organization, they might be speaking for their organization, but they're not necessarily speaking for everyone else. And in all of our movements, there are going to be diverse points of view. That makes our movements stronger for there to be diverse points of view. In many movements, it's really helpful to have different strategies that are actually secretly working together. So for example, for there to be sort of an insider strategy that's pushing legislation while there's somebody else on the sidewalk with the signs yelling, right? Because that pushes people to the bargaining table with the inside strategy. So sometimes it might not be the right message for you, but it can still be a message that helps the movement.
I actually have been giving a lot of thought to this because there's one thing in particular that irritates me now. And let me just say, I'm not a prude. I use profanity sometimes when I speak, but the crush of signs and statements that are that begin and end with profanity is just striking to me, and I think hurts the movement because it talks in a language that isn't inclusive to people. It's a language it's a lack of imagination about language and getting a message across. And I know, when I'm doing a case after a demonstration, if people get arrested or they get dispersed unlawfully, I will actually run social media on potential clients. And if somebody's posted with using that kind of language, I just say, I don't want them to be the representation for this case, because the language then becomes the issue and not the underlying issue. So, it's something that I've tried to talk a lot about with people, and people tend to say, "Oh God, you're being so prudish." I'm not a prude at all. Anybody who knows me knows.
She's a First Amendment lawyer, for crying out
loud. I'm absolutely not a prude, but I just think it just projects such a wrong message out there. So that's sort of my my view on this issue of allies who go off message.
And always thinking about your audience in
Yeah.
any advocacy action. Who are you trying to convince? Because some kinds of actions are to rile up your base and support your base, but a lot of times you're trying to convince someone who's not already with you. What will convince them?
I think that's a very good point. I think I disagree just ever so slightly. I think depending on the context, sometimes nothing drives a point home quite like a well-placed expletive does. For example, Cohen's "fuck the draft" jacket. I think that sent the message quite
Sure.
well.
But if it were more like that, that would be fine. I don't see it like that at the moment.
Fair enough.
But, yeah.
Well, you get the sense that you're going to have different reactions from different
No,
folks, so
no, it's a good
considering
point.
your audience. Do you think that really frequent rallies and marches are effective? I think right now in Los Angeles, you might be able to hit a march or rally every day of the week if you were aiming for that.
Not more than one.
Is that effective? What would be more effective?
Well, your first part of the question, is it effective? If it's building to a goal, I would have thought the voter turnout would have been much greater after all of these protests and rallies. They didn't build. See, that's what we have to build to in 2018. But if all of it is what the Bible says, sounding brass and tinkling cymbals signifying nothing, if we march with no goal. But the marches have had an impact on they have had an impact on Trump. On some things, they have. Attorneys, correct me if I'm wrong. I just think some of the impact has helped change them, and the way that the initial labor secretary did not get in there.
That's right.
The pressure on U.S. senators, some of it has its effect, but it's all got to be strategic.
Yes.
That's what I want to say.
I think that's right, and the number of members of the U.S. Congress who I have heard talk about feeling dejected and defeated and concerned about how they were possibly going to fight back after the election, knowing that they didn't feel like the allies on particular issues that they had were in control of several branches of government, and then they saw the women's marches. And it lit a fire under them. So there absolutely can be positive impacts to these types of things, but I would say you want to think about who is your target, who is your audience, who are you trying to send a message to. I've seen folks protest against elected officials who already agree with them. That is not the most effective thing to do. Sometimes you need to fire them up to fight harder, but you want to investigate as that first step and make sure you understand who your target is and what you're trying to get them to do and why.
So I actually think they've been incredibly effective, and I look at recent movements. If we hadn't had Occupy, we wouldn't have been talking nationally about income inequality in the way that we were. It became an acceptable term. If we hadn't had Black Lives Matter, we wouldn't be talking about the police issues in the same way that we are now. I think about the anti-war movement, the Vietnam War. It was a decade of protest to win that, to win that victory. And then I always think, when my mother was born, women did not have the right to vote in this country. It was 72 years between Seneca Falls and the enactment of an amendment giving women the right to vote. Not that I think it should take that long. The Civil Rights Movement and the Voting Rights Act. I think we're inclined to want immediate gratification now. And in our electronic era of, it appears on social media, therefore it is. Some things take longer. Sometimes things take much longer. But if you think about that, Congress was the first thing they were going to do was get rid of the ethics oversight. Everybody wrote in, didn't happen. Look what's happening with healthcare reform now. So I think it works, and it's not going to work every time, or it's not going to work as quickly every time, but boy, it sure has been effective. And I agree with what Sandra said about the women's marches, just infusing people with a renewed energy.
and the town halls that
Yeah,
are happening,
yeah.
especially
Yeah.
in Republican congressional districts, are very, very impactful and very important, especially this week. I hope folks know that, I think it's in our list maybe, but there's a big Affordable Care Act rally coming up on Thursday, here in Los Angeles, when we anticipate that there's supposed to be a vote in the House. I don't know.
I don't think there's gonna be
They
one.
might have to push it back, because we've been doing a really good job. So, it is Thursday. Who knows the time?
I think it's Pershing, Pershing Square.
It's the City of Our Angels Cathedral as well as the Reagan Building,
Okay.
and it will converge on the Roybal Federal Courthouse.
Yeah.
Okay.
What time?
11 o'clock,
11.
right?
11.
11 o'clock on Thursday at the Federal Building at 300 North Los Angeles is what I have. North Los Angeles Street.
Right.
So those have been incredibly effective. Brendan, I think you wanted to make some comments about disruptive speech at events. So like going to a town hall and speaking out, or going into a political fundraiser and speaking out.
Sure. So the California courts have recognized an albeit limited right to disrupt public meetings and public assemblies. And Carol, please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. I think that you've had a hand in quite a bit of this case law. But that like I said, it is a limited right. So you can go to a public meeting and speak out. The First Amendment doesn't benefit when audiences are forced to be silent. But you can't cause an actual substantial disruption of the meeting in violation of the norms for that meeting. And I know that's kind of a lot of legalese, so I'll try to unpack it a little bit. Courts have looked at, I'll give you some examples. I think that might be better. So a gentleman goes to a school board meeting and wants to make a point about garbage in the neighborhood. So he brings a bag of trash that he's collected, puts down a tarp it was actually, the meeting itself was being held in the cafeteria where the students were going to eat the next day. Takes a bag of trash and spreads it out all over the tarp. The court said, unsurprisingly, that is not in keeping with the normal behavior at that sort of a meeting, and it caused an actual disruption of the meeting. Because in order for any other speaker to give comment, they'd either have to stand over a heaping pile of smelly garbage, or else they'd have to delay the meeting a good amount of time to have custodial staff come in and pick up the trash. When you're making that kind of analysis of, what's going to be in violation of the norms of those meetings, I like to take kind of a common sense approach. So, when you're going to a job interview, you know that you probably shouldn't wear flip-flops, board shorts, and a tank top. Unless you're going to, I don't know, a swimwear company. And then, it's a similar analysis that you should engage in determining what sort of speech is acceptable. So look at past behavior at those sorts of events. What behavior has been allowed. And in terms of the disruptive piece, you have to intend to cause an actual substantial disruption. So it's not enough to look at a couple people in the audience and say, were you disturbed by this? It's going to be something that the court looks at objectively. Carol?
Yeah, just to follow up on what Brendan said, I think it depends on where the meeting is taking place. If you're going to city council, your board of education, something like that, courts are going to be much more strict in looking at that, because that's not what we call a traditional public forum. On the other hand, if you're going to a town hall with one of your legislators and they try to throw you out, you would simply bring in all the video of all the town hall meetings that are going on around the country and just say, whoa, this is what a town hall looks like. We have this old law. I mean, the law that Brendan is talking about is a little over about 150 years old now in California. And the first time it was tested was back in the 1970s, actually when I registered to vote, because I wanted to vote for Tom Hayden in the primary against John Tunney. And there were a couple of protesters at this rally for John Tunney, who was our senator for a while in the U.S. Senate, and they were arrested for booing him and chanting. It was in a public park. It was a July 4th rally, an event that was someplace. And the California Supreme Court said, look, it's a public park. People are a little rowdier in that situation. So they threw out that conviction. A couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago now, a group of activists on Skid Row were arrested. One of them was arrested when they were following around the public officials who were trying to get the business people to look at what was going on Skid Row and get the police to arrest more homeless people, because that, of course, is Los Angeles' approach to the problem. And my client was, Pete White, was arrested for disturbing a public meeting, and we went all the way up to the Federal Appeals Court, and the court agreed that you couldn't arrest somebody for engaging in loud speech on a public sidewalk when the public meeting was standing there on the public sidewalk too. So you need to use judgment about where it is. I think, and even, I'll tell you, even the most progressive judges on the Federal Appeals Court have taken a much more strict view when it involves something like a city council meeting, because the business of government has to go forward. On the other hand, if you stand up and give a silent Nazi salute, which is what one friend of mine did. Well, he's not a friend, he's a homeless activist I know. That's okay, because you're not materially disrupting. You're being silent in your speech. So silent speech is fine.
It's okay as a legal matter,
Right.
not necessarily a moral.
Right.
And Carol raises an important distinction between public forums and non-public forums or limited public forums. So your rights are going to be at their greatest in a forum that's traditionally open to free speech activity. So like a sidewalk, a public park, the streets, you're going to have the most rights in those forums. So the government can't restrict what you say based on the content of your message. In a limited public forum like a city council meeting, they can, as long as it's reasonably related to the purpose of the forum. So a city council meeting, the purpose there is to address the city council on issues that are within the city council's jurisdiction. So to give kind of an example, you could go and you could say, I think that the city council should pass a resolution that says that Trump's immigration policy is terrible. But you couldn't stand before the council and, at great length and refusing, any instructions from the council members to be quiet, just talk about how terrible Trump's immigration policy is. So it's a subtle distinction,
For
but
more than 2 minutes, for those of you who've been to city council meetings recently.
yeah.
You basically get cut off, is kind of how it functionally happens. We have just about 15 minutes, so I want to quickly run through a couple of these last questions. One is, can you explain the indivisible groups? So the indivisible groups are coming out of the Indivisible Guide, which is online, which I highly recommend for folks who are looking to get involved in pushing Congress and federal action on things. And the indivisible groups are community groups that are forming to help organize folks to do things like go to the town halls around the Affordable Care Act. So I can't speak for every individual indivisible group, but as a whole, they're very effective things to get involved in. So the next question, which perhaps Vivian and Pastor Smart can speak to, or Reverend Smart, the idea of having a clear purpose for your action has been brought up. How do you draft an objective that is focused enough to be effective while still being inclusive?
You go first.
Well, I don't know what you mean by inclusive. Inclusive of other topics, inclusive
Well,
of other
perhaps
people.
broad enough that you have allies from different movements coming to the table, but still focused on what you're trying to accomplish.
Well,
Yeah, your allies are circling around a specific issue. For instance, we're part of this Fix LA Coalition, and we have a lot of our allies. And when we're going to have we've had press events, and during the press events, we make sure that everyone knows we have had input into where we want to go, and it was we had some goals. And when we have the press events, when we have rallies, people speak on those goals. Different members of the group speak on one goal, probably two goals, but we speak on them so that everyone's a part of it. It's inclusive, but they line up as part of where we're the target. The target of Fix LA was to make sure that with all the money, there's a lot of fees that the city didn't get out of banks. It's let these banks get away with all these fees. They never pushed it. So now that's changing now.
I have never had panelists throw so many things off the stage.
Yeah. If I did that at a demonstration, it'd get me arrested.
Okay, so that's it, and so we just make sure everyone's focused on the same thing. I mean, on the specifics of their issue as it relates to the whole movement at that time, the rally. So, and someone closes by folding them all together. I hope that's something.
I think one way to think about it is you have a thing in common that you want. Your goal is in common. You want this change to law or this change to practice. But you might have different reasons for why you want it.
Right.
So you might have feminist reasons for why you want it, and impacts on the LGBTQ community for why you want it, and racial disparities for why you want it. So speaking from different perspectives, but toward the same goal, might be one way to think about it. Vivian.
And also an action has to be part of a larger plan. Just a direct action, standing by itself, doesn't really get us anywhere. But it has to be part of a plan of escalation, or a plan of community education, or or you're trying to get more and more publicity, you're trying to recruit more people, a particular population of people. And it takes a long time to come up with these plans. It's not like, and that's one of the reasons there's lots of demonstrations. There's a lot of energy right now. Nobody quite knows exactly what's going to work. And so I think there's a lot of experimentation. A lot of new people are getting engaged, and that's really good. And we're going to go through some confusion because this president is throwing every single week another 15 atrocities at us, and everyone has to figure out which ones they're going to respond to and what they feel is going to be impactful. We just don't know. We're experimenting right now, and so it takes a lot of discussion, a lot of debate and discussion, and don't just go out there and do a demonstration one-off. Make it part of a longer little campaign. It doesn't have to go on for years, but a campaign is something you're trying to do over the next 6 months.
So this question is about the fine line of determining when the police are fed up with protesters. When is that moment when, okay, now you really need to disperse, now you really need to move on. This is the moment where it's not going to be tolerated too much longer. How do you know that moment?
They're required under California law to give a dispersal order. And, my advice to people is if you don't want to get arrested when they give the dispersal order, you leave. You disperse. And there's you argue later on, as we have in a lot of litigation, about whether that dispersal order was proper or not, whether people were engaged in lawful activity, whether they could have given it at that time. But, they give the dispersal order.
That's the sign. That's
right,
the moment.
Right, because it becomes the refusal to follow a police order, which is a slightly different charge than trespass or something else. So that's my line.
Sandra, we took the street during Trayvon Martin's, and one of the deaths of a young black man. We took the street up. We marched, and then we just spontaneously took Stocker and Crenshaw. And we just stayed there in the middle. Traffic was blocked. And one of the police came over to me and said, okay, your time is up. Just like that, Carol. He said, your time is up. We had been out there. They were calling back and forth to headquarters. I don't know. And he just came over. He said, Reverend, your time is up. So I looked at everyone. I said, Ncjw, let's go. So wait a minute. No, let's go. And we got off the street and kept marching.
And this is one of the reasons you want to have some identifiable leaders who are there, who've been through these kinds of things before and understand, okay, now it's time to go. So the rules about not needing permits to protest on half of the sidewalk, but allowing people through, does that also apply to different cities and different counties other than LA? And how do you,
That
that
is the
whole
United.
thing with federal property and private property and all kinds of property?
You have the right to be on any sidewalk or anything that looks like a sidewalk. And sometimes, we have a lot of redevelopment here in the city where the sidewalk is private property, or so the police argue, and maybe Bank of America argues. If it looks like a sidewalk, quacks like a sidewalk, it's a sidewalk. That is a federal constitutional right. It is one of my favorite Supreme Court cases. It is the first Reverend Shuttlesworth case, not the second. When Reverend Shuttlesworth was the leader of the civil rights movement, and he's one of the plaintiffs in the law that struck down the Birmingham permit scheme. But in this instance, he went out with like a dozen other people. They were going to protest about some business on a public sidewalk. The police came along and said, "You can't be here." So the other 11 people dispersed, and Reverend Shuttlesworth stood his ground, got arrested, and went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. U.S. Supreme Court said he had a right to be on a public sidewalk, and the police accused him of obstructing. And the rule is, if you're standing there, and we've had the same case, same situation here in California. You know what? They can walk around you. That's what the courts now say. They can walk around you. And the last time we had this issue come up was in Ferguson, Missouri, where the police were requiring everybody to keep moving all the time. You couldn't stand still on the sidewalk. And they lost a TRO, and then we helped them with the law for, the Reverend Shuttlesworth decision and this good case from the Ninth Circuit in California, and they got the preliminary injunction. And it's really important. You have a right to be on a public sidewalk. Because if you think about it, streets, you're going to run into traffic. They're going to argue, you can't be in the street all that time because we've got to keep the traffic moving. In parks, other people reserve part of the park for an event, or they have, a basketball court. They have whatever they have, picnic tables, but no one reserves the sidewalk. That's ours.
That's ours.
That's state by state, right?
No, that's
No,
federal.
Federal constitutional.
Federal constitutional right. The forums are the same federally. There are, traditional fora, and the 3 traditional forum are parks, streets, and sidewalks, as Brendan said before. And that is a federal constitutional right.
So this, I think, is a great question, but it's a really complicated answer. What are the likely fines for civil disobedience? So if you chain yourself to a car to prevent a deportation, or if you block freeway access, and if I can summarize for the other attorneys on the panel, it really depends on what you do. Some things are misdemeanors, some things could be as much as a felony. We were talking right before the panel that I have a friend who cut a lock, and she was put in prison for over a year for destruction of federal property. So it really depends on the circumstances, and it also depends on the type of prosecutor you get and whether or not they're trying to make an example out of you.
Right.
So that's why it's important to talk to an attorney before you engage in civil disobedience and understand what you're getting into. Trespassing is one thing. Destruction of private property is really another.
And it also depends upon what entity arrests you.
Yeah, whether
It's
FBI or the
well,
local police or
yeah,
the
it's
county
gonna
sheriff.
right. It's good if it's a federal crime, if it's state, if it's local. Vivian said that Reverend Kahn goes out to the federal building in West LA. The federal building in West LA has 4 different entities within a half a block that have control over it. Okay, so the city of Los Angeles, for some reason, either, and I'm not quite sure what this is, the city either has the sidewalk but not the street, or the county has the sidewalk but not the street. So they share that. There's a little corner, where you walk into federal property at the corner of Veteran. That is federal property. So even though it's a sidewalk that otherwise is controlled, that particular strip of about 5 feet wide is federal property. And then you're right near the Wilshire Boulevard on-ramp and off-ramp for the 405 freeway. That is California Highway Patrol. If you can help it, you want to be arrested by the LAPD. Okay, seriously, you don't want to get arrested by the highway patrol. You know, if we're out there, we will negotiate with the highway patrol to let the LAPD arrest people, even if it's the freeway, because we know that you just don't want to be arrested by the highway patrol, and you don't want to be arrested by the county. You do not want to go to the county jail. It is not an attractive place, and it comes with a lot of potential illnesses, like MRSA. You know, so, and you don't want to get arrested by the feds. Although we did have a group of lawyers who recently did a civil disobedience outside the Immigration Detention Center on federal, and they deliberately stayed on the federal property. And it took about 7-8 months, and it finally got negotiated down to a slap on the wrist.
And there's just one additional point I want to make along those lines, is you can't be punished more harshly because you were engaged in First Amendment activity. So, you know, you can't be given a fine for jaywalking that's greater than what people would normally receive for jaywalking just because that was part of a demonstration.
That's a great point. What is the current status regarding having to comply with an officer's request to show your identification? If an officer asks to see your ID, do you have to show that?
So not, Carol, were you going to answer? In California, other states have stop and identify statutes. I think that they're of questionable validity, but in California at least, well, courts have upheld them.
Oh, yeah.
I think, my interpretation at least.
That would be the U.S.
questionable.
Supreme Court upheld it.
California does not have a stop and identify statute, though. So you're only required to identify yourself if you're under arrest.
So I have a little bit more practical advice. And I work a lot with activists on Skid Row and other groups. I don't know many people who are the activists at groups like LA Can who would not show an ID if stopped by the police, only because they know what's coming if they don't do that. And so sometimes you have to make a decision about if you know, for example, if the officer is wearing a body camera and you know that this is going to be recorded, and so you're on your, you've got a really solid way to not have it be the officer's word against yours, that there was no probable cause for this, stand your ground. But if the officer isn't, you're outside of the LA jurisdiction, and it's going to be the officer's word against yours, sometimes the better thing to do is just show your ID and then leave. But the officer cannot take that information down, because that is unlawful. That's a violation of the Privacy Act, the Federal Privacy Act. So, you make a judgment based on what's occurring at that instant about whether you want to leave or you want the officer to come up with some, made-up reason to keep you, and to hold you and take you into custody for not producing your ID. It's a judgment call on your part.
And if you're pulled over driving, obviously, you have to have your driver's license on you. Because driving is a privilege, not a right.
Quite a privilege in Los Angeles.
I wouldn't go that far.
So this final question is just regarding the ACLU mobile app, and it's about privacy expectations regarding images uploaded. So I think the question is, do you have to ask everyone that you're filming, is it okay to film you and upload this to the ACLU? And the answer is no.
Yeah. So you have a right to film in public. Privacy rights are dictated by whether or not you have a, quote, reasonable expectation of privacy. And if you're in a public place where anybody can film you, you don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy.
You should not hold the camera up to someone's window filming something inside their home. That is not protected. Whereas if you're in public and someone's doing something on a public street, that's protected. So I think that's all the questions we have time for, unfortunately. There were quite a number of folks who are very interested in going to constitutional law courses, and I encourage you to do that. There were also a number of questions about how do we be most effective in things other than protests, so like legislatively and at the state level and the national level. And I would encourage you to come to our monthly advocacy committee meetings, because we get into all of that, and some of the other trainings that we have later in the year really touch on it as well. In closing, let me just draw your attention to the handouts that you have on your chairs. You have the right to be heard and to remain silent when you want to by the National Lawyers Guild. This goes through quite a number of the legal rights that we talked about today. You have the 6 principles of nonviolence, very helpful, as well as the photographer's right. So what you can record, what you can take photos of, important in these situations. You have an action checklist for setting up and planning these types of events, planning, mobilizing, logistics, the program to think about if you're planning things, security, staffing, etc. And you have the 198 methods of nonviolent action, all the things you can do that will not land you in the county jail. So I hope this has been helpful to you. I want to ask that, number 1, you will be getting a survey emailed to you. Please take a few moments to fill it out and tell us what was helpful and what we could do better. Oh, it's in yellow paper on your chairs this time around. It's not via email. So please fill that out and give it to the young ladies back at the door. And will you please join me in thanking our panelists, who I think were exceptional. Don't forget, we've got a list of upcoming events at the back of your program. Please come back and join us again.